Hi everyone, Janie here. Welcome back to my garden. So last week I had such a fun opportunity. It was such a fun day. I got to go to a lavender farm with my friends Robbie and Pre. Pre set it up. It's called Cape Valley Lavender Farm. And it's so funny. I've lived here for over 10 years and it's not that far away from me. And I've never been there. Like, you know how it is. It's like you keep saying, oh, I'm going to go. And then you just never go. So finally we went and it was so incredibly beautiful. It was acres and acres of all different varieties of lavender. The smell was absolutely intoxicating. And we got to go around with the farmer, the owner. Her name is Sherry. She took us around and gave us a tour and basically taught us all she knows about growing lavender. And when she talks, you could just hear the passion in her voice. So Sherry toured us around and showed us the distillery where she distills lavender oil from the blooms, the workshop where they bundle and dry lavender, and then of course the cute farm store with all the lavender products they make. It was honestly so much fun, and I just want to thank Pri for making it happen. I seriously cannot believe I've lived here for over 10 years and never gone. If you have the opportunity to go. So having the opportunity to spend the day with a real life lavender farmer, you better believe I was asking a million questions about how to grow and care for lavender successfully. And Sherry, she did not disappoint. She is a wealth of knowledge and she's a very analytical gardener, which is great for lavender because lavender has been grown for over 2,000 years. And there are so many, I guess what you would call old wives' tales about how to care for and prune and plant lavender. And instead of just taking that at face value, Sherry has actually taken the time to test all of these tales, and now she can report back what works and what doesn't. So today I want to go over some lavender growing tips that I learned from Sherry at the lavender farm. Now I do want to say, depending on where you live, growing lavender successfully might be different. For instance, Sherry and I live in Northern California, zone 9B, where we are hot and dry. What works for us here is not going to work for someone who lives in, say, zone 5, a colder climate, or say someone who lives in Florida or Georgia where it's hot and it's humid. But don't worry, I'll give you tips for that as well. So before even planting your lavender, you need to choose the right kind. And there are 4 kinds of lavender, 4 types that you should know about. There's English lavender, French lavender, Spanish lavender, and a lavender called Lavandin that is a cross between English lavender and Portuguese lavender. English lavender was named so because it's the variety that does the best in that country's cooler climates. It's one of the most cold hardy varieties and best for culinary use because it has a low camphor content. I learned from the lavender farm that certain lavenders have a high camphor content, making them smell like Vicks Vapor Rub. So if you like that smell, just wait a minute and I'll tell you what varieties to plant. This one right here is an English lavender called Sweet Romance Lavender from Proven Winners. The next type of lavender is French lavender. This variety likes warmer zones 8 through 11, and is really beautiful with narrow, finely toothed leaves. The flowers have less scent than English lavender, but the leaves actually have more scent, almost smelling like rosemary. The next variety is really popular in my region, and it's called Spanish lavender. It's a little squatter, a little stockier than French or English lavender, and it has the most interesting pineapple-shaped blooms with little bunny ears or bracts coming out the top. The last variety that I'll talk about today is a cross between English lavender and a less common type of lavender called Portuguese lavender. This cross is called Lavandin. It's special because not only does it have the cold tolerance of English lavender, but also the heat tolerance of the Portuguese lavender. This variety is not considered edible because of its high camphor content that I was talking about earlier, the Vicks Vapor Rub. So Sherry taught us at the lavender farm that the variety Lavandin Grosso has the highest camphor content. So if you like the Vicks Vapor Rub smell, Lavender Grosso is the one for you. Okay, so now you've decided what type of lavender you want to plant. Let's talk about how to plant that lavender. You want to plant lavender in the spring once the soil temperature has warmed up, or in the fall as long as it has enough time to get rooted in before your first frost. The more sun, the better for these plants. When we moved into this property, there was actually a plum tree over this Spanish lavender right here, and this lavender looked like it was on the verge of death. We unfortunately had to cut that plum tree down because of a disease, but once this lavender plant had more sun, it perked up immediately. Here where I live, we are hot and dry. So while good air circulation is important for growing lavender, because we're so dry here, we can fudge it just a little bit. But if you live in an area with more humidity than I have, you want to make sure that you have good air circulation for your lavender plant. Humidity can do so much damage to lavender, so it's of the utmost importance that you space out your plants well enough so that they have good air circulation all around. Now, you've probably all heard this, that drainage is essential for lavender. It's been recommended to plant lavender on a mound to ensure that the plants drain properly. Here's the super interesting thing though. After talking to Sherry at the lavender farm, she's found that in dry areas, mounds can actually do more harm than good. She said that after planting lavender in mounds, she found the water was actually draining too fast for her lavender and ended up planting the rest of her lavender on flat ground. So again, if you live in a very wet area that gets rain throughout the year, planting on a mound is good advice. If you live in a drier area, it might just not be necessary. Established lavender plants are extremely drought tolerant, and the rule of thumb has always been that you only need to water lavender during prolonged dry spells. But thanks to Sherry, who's actually done the research for those of us in dry climates, she actually recommends watering lavender more than you think. She waters her lavender just like any other perennial in her garden via drip irrigation, and she's found that people are actually underwatering lavender out of fear of overwatering. So if you live in a dry climate, take this advice with a grain of salt, but you might want to think about watering your lavender more than you have been. I actually see the benefit in this because of what I've noticed in my garden. This lavender right here, we have hooked up to drip irrigation. And without us knowing, the drip irrigation was busted and this lavender was getting way too much water for weeks on end. Now, I would think that this lavender would just die and succumb to overwatering, but this lavender is actually one of the best performing lavenders that I have in my garden, and it's the one that gets the most water. Okay, now for probably the most intimidating part about growing lavender, pruning. This plant is super easy to grow, it's heat tolerant, it's drought tolerant, but the one thing this plant definitely needs is proper pruning. By pruning incorrectly, you can actually do more harm than good to your lavender plant. But not to worry, there are just two things you need to know to keep your lavender happy: how to prune and when to prune. The most important tip for pruning lavender is to identify where to make your cuts. Look at your lavender and identify where the woody base ends and the new growth begins. Always make your cuts into the new growth and not the woody sections. Lavender will not grow from the old wood, and so by cutting into the woody sections, you're essentially stopping all growth from that part of your plant. Use pruners or head shears to cut plants back to about 2 inches above the woody growth. Your goal is to cut your plants back by at least 1/3 the length of each stem and finish with a mounded, natural look. Now let's talk about when to prune. You need to cut back your lavender at least once a year to stimulate new growth. Because lavender is a semi-woody shrub, it has a tendency to create elongated woody stems if you don't prune the plant back regularly. Not only are these woody stems not very pretty, but they also bloom less and will eventually sprawl outward, leaving an ugly woody hole in the middle of your plant. The best time to prune lavender is mid to late summer after all the blooms have faded. The exact timing will depend on what type of lavender you're growing though, because some types, like this Spanish lavender, will have bloomed earlier than others. Don't feel compelled to prune all your lavender back at the same time if you're growing different varieties. Just watch for the blooms to fade and then get to work. In addition to pruning mid to late summer, you can also prune your lavender other times of year. For instance, if your lavender has suffered a lot of winter damage, you can always prune in the early spring. But you want to make sure you wait for new growth to appear, the new leaves to sprout, so you know where to cut. Remember, only cut into the new growth, not the old woody growth. You can always prune in mid-spring after the first flush of blooms to encourage a second flush, or you can prune in fall for further shaping. But just make sure if you do prune in fall, it's at least 6 weeks before your first frost. Because lavender is such a beautiful and easy to care plant, I'm planning to plant tons of it in my garden. But I have to admit, I've always been a little intimidated about the pickiness of the pruning requirements for lavender. But after visiting Sherry at the lavender farm, I feel so much better about planting, pruning, and caring for my lavender. I think the best advice for successfully growing lavender is to understand your climate and to understand what you need to do specifically for lavender in your area. Whether you have really cold winters, really wet, humid summers, or really dry, drought-prone summers, you can have success with growing lavender too. I hope you all enjoyed this, and I hope you all have a chance to get in your garden today.